The story of the Blue Fugates begins in the early 1800s, deep in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. Life there was rugged, quiet, and cut off from much of the outside world. The mountains, thick with forests and rivers, provided both beauty and hardship. Families who lived there depended on farming, hunting, and the strength of their own communities to survive. Into this isolated world came a man named Martin Fugate, a French immigrant whose arrival would spark one of the strangest medical mysteries in American history. Martin Fugate was not wealthy or powerful. He was a simple settler, like many others who made their way into Kentucky in search of land, independence, and a chance to build a family. He chose to settle along a waterway called Troublesome Creek, a name that reflected the tough life of the people who lived there. Troublesome Creek was remote, tucked away from towns and cities. Travel was difficult and medical care was almost non-existent. In many ways, it was a world frozen in time, where families relied on each other more than on the outside world. Martin married a woman named Elizabeth Smith, a fair-skinned redhead said to be as pale as milk. Together, they started their family in this remote valley. On the surface, their story seemed like any other pioneer tale, two people working the land, raising children, and doing their best to survive the harsh realities of mountain life. But hidden in their bloodline was something extraordinary. What no one knew then was that Martin carried a rare genetic trait, and Elizabeth did as well. When two people with this trait had children, it increased the chances that their sons and daughters would inherit a mysterious condition that would make them look unlike anyone else in the region. This condition was called methemoglobinemia, and though science had not yet discovered it, the Fugates' children were about to show its effects. One by one, some of the Fugate children were born with skin that was not the usual pink or tan of healthy babies, but a strange shade of blue. It wasn't the blue of sadness or bruises. It was a literal coloring of their skin. Their lips were purplish, their fingernails tinted, their faces carrying a bluish cast. For neighbors and family members, it was shocking and unexplainable. In an age when medicine was still full of superstition, whispers began to spread. Yet in the Fugates' home, life went on. These blue children were not sick in the ways people feared. They grew up running along the creek, working on farms, playing in the fields. Their hearts pumped, their lungs breathed, their spirits thrived. The only difference was the unusual tint of their skin, a visible reminder of the strange inheritance passed down from Martin and Elizabeth. In the hills of Kentucky, families were often isolated not only by geography, but also by marriage patterns. Because communities were small and transportation limited, it was common for families to marry within the same circle of neighbors or distant cousins. For the Fugates, this meant the blue gene continued to circulate through the family for generations. The mountains kept them separate from outsiders, and their unique appearance became part of the hidden history of Troublesome Creek. Despite their unusual condition, the Fugates were hard-working people. They lived simply, raising livestock, growing crops, and fishing in the very creek that gave them their home. Their children helped in the fields, learned to cook over wood fires, and shared in the joys and struggles of mountain life. Poverty was common, but so was resilience. The Fugates endured storms, harsh winters, and the grind of daily labor with quiet strength. What makes their story so remarkable is not only the rare genetic condition they carried, but the way they survived with dignity despite it. In an era when difference often brought ridicule, the Fugates learned to live with the stares and whispers. Neighbors might have called them the Blue People, but among themselves they were simply family. It is important to remember that the Fugates did not seek fame or attention. They never imagined that one day their descendants would become the subject of medical journals, scientific studies, and documentaries. To them, they were just ordinary people living ordinary lives, except for the extraordinary color of their skin. In fact, many outside the hills of Kentucky never even knew they existed until over a century later, when doctors began to investigate. For decades, their story was passed down quietly, more folklore than fact. Yet it was all rooted in the real lives of a family trying to survive in one of the most challenging parts of America. The Fugates' settlement in the 1800s reminds us of how environment and circumstance shape destiny. Had they lived in a city, with more people and more opportunities to marry outside their community, the blue gene might have disappeared within a generation. But because they lived in the remote Appalachian hills, their story continued, generation after generation, until it became one of America's strangest and most haunting mysteries. This first chapter of the Fugates' story, the chapter of a family in the hills of Kentucky, is both ordinary and extraordinary. It is ordinary because Martin and Elizabeth lived like countless other pioneer families, working hard to survive in isolation. It is extraordinary because their bloodline carried a hidden secret that would one day capture the imagination of scientists and storytellers alike. And in this ordinary, extraordinary tale lies the first lesson: our differences do not erase our humanity. The Fugates were not defined only by their blue skin. They were defined by their hard work, their resilience, and their ability to carry on despite judgment and mystery. By the time Martin Fugate and his wife Elizabeth began raising their family along the waters of Troublesome Creek in the early 1800s, their lives already stood apart from many in Kentucky. They were pioneers carving out existence in a rugged, isolated valley. But soon, something far stranger and more haunting than hardship or isolation would mark their family for generations: the birth of the children with blue skin. It started quietly. One child born to Martin and Elizabeth had skin that appeared unusually dark, with a bluish tint. At first, neighbors and midwives were puzzled. Perhaps it was just the lighting, perhaps the cold, or perhaps something temporary. But when the child grew older, the tint remained. Soon, another child was born with the same unusual coloring, and then another. It became impossible to ignore. These children were not pale, ruddy, or sunburned like most Appalachian mountain folk. Their lips were purplish, their fingertips tinged like frostbite, and their complexions carried shades of blue, sometimes faint, sometimes striking. To the people of Troublesome Creek, this was more than unusual. It was almost otherworldly. In a time when medical understanding was limited, explanations ranged from superstition to whispers of curses. Some locals speculated that the Fugates were marked by something unnatural. Others suggested it was simply the blood. And though no one could explain it, the image of a family with blue skin became both a source of gossip and a defining trait of the Fugates. The truth, as science would later reveal, was far more fascinating and less mystical. The Fugates carried a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia. This disorder affects how hemoglobin in the blood carries oxygen. Normally, hemoglobin delivers oxygen efficiently to tissues, giving skin a healthy red or pink glow. But in people with methemoglobinemia, an abnormal form of hemoglobin builds up, reducing the blood's ability to carry oxygen. The result is that the skin appears bluish. But in the early 1800s, the Fugates had no way of knowing this. To them, and to their neighbors, all that mattered was that some children were born different. And in an isolated mountain community, difference always stood out. Despite their unusual appearance, the blue children of the Fugates grew up much like any others. They played barefoot along the creek, helped gather firewood, and tended to the animals. Their blue coloring didn't seem to affect their health much beyond appearance. In fact, most of them lived long lives, working hard and raising children of their own. The condition, while striking, was not a death sentence. It was simply part of who they were. The isolation of Troublesome Creek, however, meant that this rare gene had few chances to disappear. Families in the Appalachian Mountains often married within their own small community. Roads were poor, travel was difficult, and most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Over generations, this meant that the gene for methemoglobinemia continued to appear in the Fugate family tree. Cousins married cousins, children carried the recessive gene, and the cycle continued. Soon, the blue people of Kentucky were no longer just Martin and Elizabeth's children, but an entire branch of their descendants. The gene spread silently, waiting until two carriers had children together. Then, once again, a child would be born with skin the color of the sky. Stories of the blue people spread beyond Troublesome Creek. Travelers who passed through the region would return with tales of families whose skin carried shades of blue. In an era when newspapers thrived on oddities and curiosities, the Fugates were sometimes spoken of as legends rather than flesh and blood people. But to those who knew them, they were simply neighbors, farmers, churchgoers, ordinary in every way except their appearance. It is here that the Fugate story carries a lesson deeper than genetics. Their children were born into a world quick to judge difference, and yet they persisted. They showed that while their skin was blue, their humanity was the same as anyone else's. They laughed, they worked, they married, they carried burdens, and they built lives. The birth of the blue people was shocking at first, but over time it became part of the identity of the community. Families accepted it, even if outsiders looked on with curiosity. Within the hills of Kentucky, the Fugates endured not as a spectacle, but as survivors. Science would not catch up with their story for more than a century. It wasn't until the 20th century that doctors would travel into the mountains, study the family, and uncover the genetic basis of their condition. Until then, their blue skin remained a mystery. But what matters most is that through all those years of misunderstanding, the Fugates carried on with quiet resilience. Their children, born with skin unlike anyone else's, remind us that being different is not the same as being broken. The Fugates' lives teach us that beauty and dignity exist even in the most unusual places. So when we look back at the birth of the blue people, we should not see only a genetic curiosity or a haunting mystery. We should see a family who faced whispers and wonder, who endured stares and stories, but who still tilled their land, raised their children, and lived their lives with courage. The Fugates did not ask to be different. They were born that way. But in their difference lies a story that would one day inspire not just science, but compassion. To understand the story of the Blue Fugates, we must understand the world they lived in. The Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky in the 1800s were among the most isolated places in America. Roads were nearly impassable, schools were few and far between, and doctors were almost non-existent. Families like the Fugates depended on themselves and on their neighbors, because the outside world rarely reached the hollows of Troublesome Creek. Isolation shaped every part of their lives. The steep mountains cut off easy travel, and rivers that swelled in spring rains made even short journeys dangerous. Few families left, and few outsiders came in. It was a place where traditions were passed down from generation to generation, unchanged by the rapid modernization happening in the cities. For better or worse, this isolation preserved the unique way of life in the Appalachian Hills. For the Fugates, isolation meant survival depended on community and resilience. They farmed corn and beans, raised pigs and chickens, and gathered food from the forests. Winters were long and harsh, and families often went hungry when crops failed. Medical care was so scarce that people relied on home remedies, herbal teas, poultices, and folk practices passed down through elders. Illness and injury were part of life, but survival meant adapting and helping one another. It was within this closed world that the Fugates' unusual genetic condition endured. The rarity of travel and the small size of the community meant that families often intermarried. Cousins married cousins, neighbors married neighbors, and the gene that caused methemoglobinemia stayed alive within the Fugate bloodline. In larger, more diverse populations, such a rare trait might have disappeared. But here, where choices were few, it reappeared generation after generation. The isolation of the Fugates was both a burden and a shield. On one hand, their difference, the striking blue tint of their skin, was less of a scandal among neighbors who knew them personally. Within Troublesome Creek, they were accepted as part of the community. People might have whispered, but they were still recognized as hard-working farmers, church members, and kin. On the other hand, the same isolation meant they lacked access to the medical knowledge that could have explained and treated their condition. For nearly a century, the mystery of their blue skin remained unsolved. The Fugates' story during these years is not just about science or genetics. It is about endurance. Life in Appalachia required strength, and the Fugates demonstrated it daily. They carried water from creeks, chopped wood for long winters, and tilled stubborn soil. Blue skin did not stop them from plowing fields, bearing children, or contributing to the survival of their community. This resilience is important because it reframes the narrative. To outsiders, the Fugates became the Blue People of Kentucky, a curiosity, almost a legend. But to themselves, they were not defined by their skin. They were survivors of poverty, of isolation, of harsh conditions. Their story is not one of weakness but of endurance. Isolation also brought with it a kind of freedom. In the mountains, far from the judgment of urban centers, the Fugates lived without constant ridicule. Yes, travelers sometimes gossiped about the Blue family, and stories spread beyond the hills, but within their community, they were allowed to live in peace. Their neighbors judged them less by the color of their skin and more by the strength of their work and the size of their harvest. In a society that often stigmatizes difference, this quiet acceptance was rare. Still, isolation came with heavy costs. The lack of education meant that generations of Fugates grew up unable to read or write. Opportunities to break free from the cycle of poverty were scarce. With no doctors to study them, their condition remained unexplained. Children were born blue, lived blue, and died blue, with little hope of understanding why. The Fugates' survival also reflects the broader story of Appalachia. These mountain families were often portrayed by outsiders as backward or strange. Yet, when we look closely, we see a people of strength, resourcefulness, and perseverance. The Fugates were no different. Their blue skin set them apart, but their lives mirrored the hardships and determination of countless Appalachian families. One can imagine the Fugates gathered by firelight in their cabins, telling stories of ancestors, sharing songs, and passing down folk traditions. Their isolation may have limited them, but it also gave them a strong sense of identity and belonging. They knew who they were, and in their mountains, that was enough. The lesson from their survival is a universal one. Even in the most challenging environments, human beings adapt. The Fugates adapted not only to their physical environment, but also to their genetic condition. They lived with it, carried it, and passed it on, not as a mark of shame, but as part of their heritage. In time, science would uncover the truth of their condition. Doctors would explain methemoglobinemia, treatments would be discovered, and the mystery of their blue skin would finally be solved. But in those years of isolation, long before medicine caught up, the Fugates proved something profound. Difference does not prevent survival. Their isolation shaped them, but it did not break them. They endured poverty, they endured whispers, and they endured the haunting mystery of their own blood. And in their endurance lies their greatest lesson. Sometimes survival itself is the most powerful form of strength. For nearly a century, the Fugates lived quietly in the Appalachian hills, raising children, working their farms, and carrying on with their lives. To the people of Troublesome Creek, their blue, tinted skin was unusual but no longer shocking. It had become a part of local identity, a mystery accepted but not explained. But as America moved into the 20th century, the outside world began to take notice. Doctors, scientists, and curious travelers started hearing about a family of blue people hidden deep in Kentucky's mountains. To them, it was not just gossip. It was a scientific puzzle waiting to be solved. By the 1940s and 1950s, modern medicine had advanced enough that rare conditions attracted researchers. Word of the Fugates reached the ears of doctors who wanted to understand how a family could live with such a striking difference. Was it a disease, a strange poisoning from the water, or perhaps some rare genetic defect? The Fugates had become, without ever seeking it, a living case study. One of the most determined researchers was Dr. Madison Coyne, a young hematologist from the University of Kentucky. In the early 1960s, he traveled into the Appalachian Hills to see the Fugates for himself. He had heard the rumors, but what he saw in person left him astonished. Members of the family indeed had skin that ranged from dusky purple to a startling shade of blue. Their lips were dark like blueberries. Their fingernails carried a lavender tint, and yet they were strong, alert, and living normal lives. Dr. Coyne was fascinated, but he also felt compassion. He realized that while locals accepted the Fugates, outsiders sometimes ridiculed them, and the family themselves lived with confusion about their condition. He wanted to give them answers, and if possible, relief. His research revealed the underlying cause of a condition called methemoglobinemia. In simple terms, It meant that the Fugates' blood carried too much methemoglobin, a type of hemoglobin that cannot bind oxygen effectively. Normally, red blood cells use hemoglobin to deliver oxygen throughout the body, giving skin its healthy pinkish glow. But in the Fugates, a genetic mutation caused high levels of methemoglobin, which turned their blood a chocolate, brown color and made their skin appear blue. Dr. Coyne traced the condition back through generations of the Fugate family tree. Because the Appalachian community was so isolated, marriages often occurred within a small group of families. When two people carrying the recessive gene had children, the condition reappeared. In scientific terms, it was a rare genetic quirk amplified by isolation. In human terms, it was a family mystery finally explained. But Coyne did not stop at solving the riddle. He wanted to help. He discovered that the condition could be treated with a simple chemical methylene blue. This substance, when given in small amounts, could convert methemoglobin back into normal hemoglobin, allowing the blood to carry oxygen properly. When Dr. Coyne gave the Fugates doses of methylene blue, the change was astonishing. Within hours, their blue tint faded, replaced by a healthy pink glow. For the Fugates, this was nothing short of miraculous. Generations had lived believing their skin color was permanent, perhaps even a curse. Now, with a small treatment, they could look like everyone else. Though the effect wore off over time and had to be repeated, the discovery gave them not only relief but dignity. It showed them that their difference was not a punishment, but a solvable medical condition. The story of Dr. Coyne and the Fugates spread, capturing national attention. Newspapers wrote about the blue people of Kentucky, turning them into a human interest phenomenon. Scientists praise the case as one of the most striking examples of how genetics and environment could interact to create unique conditions. For the medical world, it was an opportunity to study how rare mutations worked. For the Fugates, it was the first time outsiders treated them with genuine care instead of curiosity or mockery. Yet, even as science solved the mystery, the humanity of the Fugates remained at the center. They were not simply the blue people anymore. They were a family whose story had contributed to science. They became a reminder that behind every medical condition, there are real people with lives, dreams, and dignity. The meeting of science and mystery in the Fugates' story also holds a deeper lesson. It shows us the power of knowledge to replace fear. For generations, people whispered about curses and strange bloodlines. Children grew up hearing rumors about their skin, but with one doctor's curiosity and compassion, superstition gave way to understanding. Fear was replaced by facts, and shame was replaced by hope. It also demonstrates how even the most isolated lives can influence the wider world. The Fugates lived in the mountains, far from universities, laboratories, and hospitals. Yet their condition provided insights into blood chemistry and genetics that benefited people far beyond Kentucky. Their story proves that every life, no matter how remote or unusual, has the power to teach the world something valuable. For the Fugates themselves, survival had always been the goal. But through science, they gained something more: recognition. They were no longer just mountain folk with strange skin. They were pioneers of a different kind, people whose resilience carried their family through generations until medicine finally caught up. And so, the mystery of the blue people met the light of science. What once seemed haunting and inexplicable became a story of genetics, perseverance, and healing. The Fugates' story reminds us that every mystery has an answer, and every difference has a meaning. When we look back at the lives of the Blue Fugates, it is tempting to focus only on the strangeness of their skin or the mystery that puzzled scientists for so long. But to stop there would be to miss the deeper story, the story of resilience, dignity, and the quiet strength of a family who lived through hardship with grace. The Fugates were not defined solely by the blue tint of their skin. They were defined by how they carried themselves despite it. From the very beginning, the Fugates faced challenges most of us could hardly imagine. Poverty, isolation, and hard labor shaped their lives in the Appalachian Mountains. Add to this a genetic condition that made them visibly different, and their struggles were compounded. In communities where gossip spread quickly, difference often meant ridicule. For many families, such a stigma could have led to despair. But the Fugates refused to be broken by it. Instead, they learned to live with their condition and carried on as farmers, miners, and homemakers. They married, raised children, and contributed to their community like everyone else. Their blue skin was visible, yes, but their humanity shone brighter. To their neighbors, they were not freaks or outcasts. They were simply the Fugates. And that in itself is a testament to their resilience. They turned what might have been a source of shame into a part of their identity that did not stop them from living. Resilience is not just about survival. It is about the ability to move forward even when the world places obstacles in your path. The Fugates embodied this truth. They endured stares and whispers from outsiders who treated them like curiosities. Yet, they never stopped working their farms, attending church, and raising families. They showed that difference does not erase dignity. Their story also reveals a profound lesson about the power of acceptance. Within the isolation of Troublesome Creek, the Fugates were shielded in some ways from the harshest judgments of the outside world. Neighbors knew them personally, and familiarity softened prejudice. The community may have whispered about their blue skin, but it did not exclude them. This quiet acceptance allowed the Fugates to live with confidence, a reminder that communities can either break or lift up those who are different. The Fugates teach us that compassion, even in small, rural places, can make all the difference. But resilience is not only about enduring difference, it is also about facing the unknown. For generations, the Fugates lived without answers. They did not know why some of their children were born blue, why the color stayed, or whether it was dangerous. They had no doctors to explain or treat it. They lived in mystery, yet they did not let that mystery consume them. Instead, they embraced life as it was given to them. That kind of resilience, living without certainty, yet still moving forward, is a powerful lesson for all of us. When science finally caught up in the 20th century, it did more than solve a mystery. It validated the resilience the Fugates had shown all along. Dr. Madison Coyne's discovery of a treatment did not erase their blue skin from history, but it did show the world that the Fugates had lived with a condition that was medical, not mythical. Their endurance was not just personal strength. It was also a gift to science, providing knowledge that would help others. Their resilience also carried a spiritual lesson. Many Fugates were people of faith, attending church like their neighbors, singing hymns, and finding comfort in community. Their story reminds us that resilience is not only physical but emotional and spiritual. Faith, family bonds, and shared traditions gave them the courage to endure. It was not just the strength of individuals, but the strength of community and kinship that carried them through. For modern readers, the lesson is clear: adversity does not define us. Our response to it does. The Fugates teach us that resilience is not about erasing difference or pretending it does not exist. It is about embracing life with courage, even when life looks different from others. Their story reminds us that the color of our skin, whether blue, black, or brown, does not measure our worth. What matters is the strength of our character, the love we give, and the dignity with which we live. Their lives also challenge us to reconsider how we see those who are different. For too long, difference has been treated as something to fear or ridicule. The Fugates show us another way difference can be a source of identity, resilience, and even contribution to science. Instead of judgment, we should respond with curiosity, compassion, and respect. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Fugates is this: resilience is quiet but powerful. It does not always shout or demand recognition. Sometimes it looks like a family rising at dawn to tend their fields, even when the world sees them as strange. Sometimes it looks like children laughing by the creek, unaware of the whispers that follow them. Sometimes it looks like generations carrying on without answers, believing that life, no matter how different, is still worth living. In the end, the Fugates' blue skin did not diminish them. It highlighted their strength. They lived, endured, and contributed, not in spite of their condition, but alongside it. Their resilience tells us that hardship may shape us, but it does not have to break us. The story of the Blue Fugates could have remained nothing more than a curiosity, whispered in Appalachian hollers and retold as folklore about strange, blue people living in the mountains of Kentucky. but their legacy has proven far greater than gossip or superstition. Today, the Fugates are remembered not just for the haunting color of their skin, but for the powerful lessons their story leaves behind, lessons of resilience, science, compassion, and the meaning of human dignity. The first part of their legacy lies in science. For generations, the Fugates lived without knowing the cause of their condition. Families whispered about curses or strange blood, but there were no answers. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that doctors like Dr. Madison Coyne stepped forward with curiosity and compassion. His study of the Fugates revealed the role of genetics in rare conditions and gave the medical world a practical demonstration of how recessive traits can persist in isolated populations. Even more remarkable was his discovery of a treatment. With methylene blue, the condition that once marked the Fugates for ridicule could be reversed in hours. Their legacy, then, is not just about mystery but about progress. The way human curiosity and scientific inquiry can turn confusion into understanding and stigma into healing. Thanks to the Fugates, medicine gained a deeper grasp of blood disorders, genetic inheritance, and the importance of recognizing rare conditions. Yet the Fugates' legacy does not stop at science. It is also a story of acceptance and community. In the isolated world of Troublesome Creek, the Fugates were known and, in many ways, accepted. Their neighbors may have whispered about their appearance, but they still worked side by side, went to the same churches, and shared the same struggles of mountain life. This acceptance allowed the Fugates to live with dignity despite being visibly different. Their legacy reminds us that community can either break or lift up those who stand apart. And in this case, community gave them the space to endure. The Fugates also leave us with a legacy of resilience. They endured poverty, isolation, and misunderstanding. They lived for more than a century without answers, yet they did not allow their difference to destroy their spirit. They farmed, married, raised children, and laughed like any other family. They carried on without complaint, even when outsiders treated them as curiosities. Their resilience is perhaps their most profound gift to history, proof that human beings can endure difference with grace. But perhaps the most inspiring part of their legacy is how their story forces us to reflect on what it means to be human. Too often, society measures worth by appearances, skin color, physical traits, or surface-level differences. The Fugates challenge us to look deeper. Their blue skin, once seen as strange or even frightening, now stands as a symbol of the diversity of human life. They remind us that every body, no matter how unusual, carries dignity, value, and lessons worth sharing. Their story also challenges us to reconsider how we respond to the unknown. For generations, their blue skin was treated as a mystery, something to whisper about rather than understand. Yet once science sought to learn rather than judge, the truth emerged, and with it, compassion. Their legacy calls us to face difference not with fear or ridicule, but with curiosity, empathy, and respect. In many ways, the Fugates' legacy is not limited to their family. It belongs to all of us. They remind us that each person carries something unique, whether visible or invisible, that makes them part of the larger human story. Some differences may be physical, like skin color. Others may be invisible, like hidden illnesses or struggles. But all deserve recognition, compassion, and dignity. Today, when people speak of the Blue Fugates, they rarely speak with mockery. Instead, they speak with fascination, admiration, and even respect. The family who once lived in obscurity has become a symbol, a reminder that even those hidden in remote corners of the world can leave a mark on history. Their story inspires doctors, scientists, and everyday people alike to see difference as opportunity rather than barrier. And this is where their legacy becomes most motivational. The Fugates teach us that no matter how unusual our challenges may be, we can still rise above them. Their condition might have set them apart, but it did not stop them from living full lives. That is a lesson for anyone who has ever felt different, excluded, or judged. The Fugates remind us that our differences do not define our limits, they define our story. So what is the lasting legacy of the Fugates? It is not just blue skin. It is the reminder that science can turn mystery into understanding, communities can choose compassion over ridicule, and individuals can endure hardship with dignity. Their story is not just haunting, it is inspiring. When we remember the Blue Fugates, let us not only think of the unusual shade of their skin. Let us think of their courage to live without answers, their strength to carry on despite whispers, and the way their lives changed science forever. Let us think of them as a family whose difference became their gift to the world, because in the end, the legacy of the Fugates is a mirror held up to us all. It asks us, how will we treat those who are different? Will we whisper and judge, or will we learn and embrace? The Fugates show us the better path, the path of resilience, acceptance, and inspiration. Their story began on the banks of Troublesome Creek, in a place of hardship and isolation. But it ends far beyond Kentucky, in the hearts and minds of people everywhere who see in their blue skin not a curse, but a call to celebrate difference, to seek understanding, and to live with dignity no matter what life gives us. That is the legacy of the Blue Fugates, and it is a legacy that will continue to inspire for generations to come.